All right, so off we go. The reason I said I'd like to do a space show today is because I got an email, a repeat of an email that he sent to me a couple days ago that I just plain forgot about. An email from Bert Rutan, who is going to be submitting a kind of a report to Newt Gingrich and get this to Pence and to President Trump about the future of America's space program, what that future would look like. And as I said to Bert, it's an honor to be asked to comment on that in any form, but to be asked by Bert Rutan to comment on America's space future is something that's beyond my capacity to fully describe. So I had about an hour to think it over, and I'll tell you what I came up with regarding, I think, the direction for the future of the American space program. I said basically the future of the space program in this country will be dependent on the same thing that every other sector of the economy is dependent on. It's no different than anything else we do as humans in this third wave information age. So, what are those three things? Well, for me, the three qualities that the space program should have that our world is increasingly showing are competition, open source, and sizzle. So let's start with competition. Natasha and I went to Colorado Springs not too long ago, and we made good time through the line at LAX security, so we thought anyway. We basically got to the TSA agent who takes your boarding pass and your passport, looks them over, makes sure it's you, get past that guy. So far, so good. Great. We're making wizard time. So we get past that guy, and we're taking off our shoes and belts and all the rest of this hardware and putting it in the plastic bins, and we realize, standing there, that 7, 8 people in front of me, something like that. We realized that the bins are not moving and the conveyor belt's not moving, and a quick look at why the conveyor belt's not moving shows us that it's not moving because the woman who was operating the scanner had never operated a scanner before. Matter of fact, I feel relatively certain that she's never operated a computer before. And sitting at her side was a coworker who was leaning in and pointing to every single thing on the scan and then showing her where the correct button was to do this. And she'd look down, look up, look down, look up, hit the button, look down, look up, look down, look up. He'd point out something different when the scan changed. And after a while, I got out my watch and realized that the TSA was training somebody on this position as we were waiting, and that the time it took for this person came out to, on average, by my watch, 2.5 minutes per bag. It's not per person, per bag, per bin. 2.5 to 3 minutes per bin. And pretty quickly, people behind me started getting huffy about it, and I guess if I hadn't been with Natasha, I would have been leading that charge, but in any event. And somebody said, hey, this isn't really exactly the place to do training, is it? And the senior TSA guys took this kind of attitude, like, you got to train people somehow, right? I mean, you got to train people somehow. My feeling is you might want to train them in a training facility rather than taking 2.5 minutes per bag. So from the time it took us to hand the passports and IDs to the TSA agent and then get through the metal detector and get on the other side and have all of our items out of there, the distance was, what is that distance, 10 yards? 33 minutes it took us. Now, I was shocked. Everybody was shocked. By the way, they called a supervisor, and this woman came over, looked around, didn't say a word, went back to her desk, sat down, and went back to doing whatever nothing she wasn't doing. So got on the plane, got to Colorado Springs, got off at nighttime, went to the Enterprise rent-a-car. Beautiful situation, walk right in, nobody in line ahead of us. Nice guy checks me in. I hand him my driver's license. He says, oh, I see it's your birthday 2 days ago. I said, yeah, it's my wife's birthday the day before mine too. He says, isn't that congratulations. Let me just do something for you. Reaches down, grabs a card, and he writes something, F car on it, fleet car, something. He says, I've just upgraded you a couple levels just as a small birthday present, And I thought, well, that was pretty nice of you. Thank you very much. So he was very kind, and we were, from that time I got to the counter to the time I was in the car was about 5 minutes, and I had an upgraded car, and I'm going back to Enterprise Rent a Car until something horrible happens. They're my guys. And so now that gets to the reason why we told this story and what it has to do with the space program. Reason that the guy at Enterprise gave me that upgrade and had the authority to give me the upgrade was because if I look out the window from Enterprise Rent a Car in Denver Airport, I can see 50 yards away National, Thrifty, Avis, Hertz, Dollar, Alamo, and a bunch of others. And if I don't like the way Enterprise Rent a Car is treating me, I'll just get out the door and I'll go and give my money to one of those people. And then the people who work for Enterprise Rent a Car will be out of jobs. And so that's why they can do things like, happy birthday, here's a nicer car. But I don't get to go to a different TSA when I'm at the airport. I don't get to go to a different TSA. And they know it. And that's why they don't care if it takes 3 minutes per bag. They don't care if it takes 3 minutes per bag. They don't care if I miss my plane. They don't care if the fact that this person who is training on the job misses weapons or bombs. They don't care about any of that because they don't have to care about it. And therein lies the difference between competition and non-competition. So the first thing that our space program has to be is competitive because NASA is the TSA. I've said this 100 times on this show. I used to have the NASA vector tattooed on the inside of my skin. I love that agency so much. But even in its heyday, it was still a government bureaucracy. And right now they spend about as much money as they did during the last year that they were flying 4 space shuttles. And now they're not flying anything. So the first thing we need, I think, in a space program is we need the pressure of competition, which is what drives the experience at Enterprise Rent a Car from being so different from the experience at the TSA. And if we can imagine a world where there were no private airlines, that if you wanted to go from New York to Los Angeles, you had to get on a Federal Aviation Administration aircraft, and that's all there ever was the FAA. Well, flying from New York to Los Angeles in 2018 would happen in a propeller-driven airplane with 30 passengers and at an altitude of 8,000 feet in the weather, bounced around. It'd take you 19 hours, and it cost you $7,000. That's the world we would have if the government ran air transportation in this country. But the government runs space transportation, and that's the world we have. So the first thing we need is unfettered competition amongst all of these players. The second thing I think we need is open source. Did a little research for this. And I remember when I bought my iPhone, I bought an iPhone well after the iPhone came out and after I'd seen them a few times. We were at a late showing of a movie theater, of a movie at a studio, I want to say at the Fox studio in Century City, I think. And it was Sunday night at about 11 or something. A bunch of us said, we should go get a bite to eat someplace. Anybody know where? Nobody knew the neighborhood. This guy got out an app called Around Me, and he said, well, here's all the places. Here's the phone numbers. Here's their closing times. I said, damn it, that is astonishing. A week or two later, I was in a restaurant with somebody, and something was playing on the stereo, on the restaurant speakers, so barely legible, audible, barely intelligible through all the noise of the, dishes and the conversations and stuff. Let's just say it was Girl from Ipanema. It was something like that kind of light jazz thing. Friend hits a button on an app called Shazam, holds it up, listens, comes back, here's the song, here's where you can buy it, here's how you download it. That blew my mind. And then things like, apps where you point at something and it'll translate a sign for you in real time from German to English, or you can point at an airplane, and since the phone knows where it is and it knows the angle and the altitude that it's looking, and since it knows where airplanes are by consulting the FAA database, it can tell you what that airplane is, what flight it is, where it's going, how fast it's going, all the rest of it. These kind of jaw-dropping apps. Well, research I did said that just prior to the release of the iPhone, Steve Jobs had assumed that it would be closed architecture. In other words, The only apps that you could get for the iPhone would be those made by Apple. And the original iPhone shipped with 16 apps. And of the 16 apps, all of them were the kind of sort of bland, relatively boring things like calendar, clock, phone, notes, these kind of things. None of the jaw-dropping apps, like the planetarium things where you hold the camera up, and it'll, what's that bright light? You hold it up there and the whole sky moves. Oh, it's Saturn, and all. Here comes a picture. None of that stuff. None of it. So just before he released the first iPhone, Jobs decided to change his mind, and so he basically opened the App Store. And when they launched in 2007, I think it was 2007, 2008, there were 500 apps that you could download, in addition to the 16 that came with the iPhone. 1 year later, there were 800 apps, and there had been 10 million downloads. And 10 years later, there are 2.2 million apps and 160 billion or 130 billion downloads. So the reason I think that open source is important is because there are hundreds of people who are very smart working for Apple, but there are hundreds of millions of people who are very smart that are working for themselves. And the reason I say that the space program of the future needs to be open sourced is so many times the breakthrough ideas, the real breakthrough revolutionary ideas, don't come from the big players. The big players got to be big because at one point they had revolutionary breakthrough ideas, but that's probably when they were just two guys in a garage and they make their own decisions. After a while, the company gets so big and develops its own inertia that it becomes virtually impossible for them to do something that's so out of the box that they simply can't conceive of it. And that's where the guys in the garage come in, and that's where open source comes in. So subsidies actually suppress innovation. When you subsidize a company for doing something, pay government money, you don't get more innovation, you get less. That's what companies want. There's nothing they'd rather have better than, okay, so I built this steamship. Now I don't have to compete for passengers. I get paid whether I go full or empty, whether I'm fast or slow, safe or dangerous, doesn't matter. I get the same check. So why should I do any of those things? Subsidies are terrible, but prizes are interesting. Prizes are interesting because, first of all, they're only awarded in the case of success. So you're not paying for failure. If you have the X Prize, for example, that Bert won, was a $10 million prize, and the X Prize was structured in such a way that in order to win the prize, you had to put a vehicle capable of carrying a passenger to outer space, which was defined as 308, I think it's 75 kilometers, something like that. It's 318,000 feet, something like that. You had to get it into outer space, and then you had to go again in the same vehicle within 2 weeks. Now, they put the weight of a passenger in there because it was a test program. They didn't put two people on board, but they had enough weight for it to have been two people. And Bert won that one fairly easily with Spaceship One by several test flights. And then finally, for the X Prize flights, up they go. They pass 318,000 feet. They come down. Less than 2 weeks later, they do it again. Congratulations, here's $10 million. Now, as it turns out, Paul Allen probably spent $30 million to get the $10 million. But because it was a prize and because it was high profile and because it had never been done before and it was cool, it attracted a bunch of players that would not have been there before. If you ask an investor for $5 million and tell him, if we're the first people there, we get 10, he'll at least listen to you. Many investors, I've had this experience myself, needless to say, if you say, look, no, this is important for the future or whatever, well, no, I'm sorry, no, somebody else can do it. So I think open source and getting people into the game is important. And as I said, NASA was doing all three of not only not doing the three things we needed to do, competitiveness, open source, and sizzle, but NASA has been for the last 30, 40 years the antithesis of competition, open source, and sizzle. So NASA, for many years now, since private space really began to take off, NASA's job is to keep people out of space, put up regulations, barriers, ridiculous tests, all of these things needed to make sure that nobody gets to go except for them. many years ago, I don't remember how long, I want to say it was around 2003 or 4, somewhere in there. I got, it was probably 4 or 5, somewhere around there. I have friends at X-Core, a rocket company, and they asked me if I wanted to ride in the back seat of Burt Rutten's brother, Dick Rutten, and his Long Easy, and take photographs for something they had to do for NASA. And I said, you betcha. I'm sure if Dick didn't remember. If he did, he probably scoffed at me in the way I deserved. I was wearing a flight suit and all the rest of this nonsense. He probably just thought, who the hell is this guy? Dick and I became friends at Oshkosh, and he's a terrific guy. One of the most amazing pilots who ever lived. But in any event, here's what NASA said. NASA basically said to X-Core, who was also working on a suborbital vehicle as a result of this prize, NASA said to them, well, what happens if you lose your navigation system on the way down? How will you land? And X-Core said, we will look out the window. Any other questions that we can help you with? They're not flying these things under instrument conditions. It's the Mojave Desert. If we lose our navigation system, we will look out the window, determine where we are, and fly back to Mojave. What's so tough about this? NASA, this is why I'm telling the story, exclusionary NASA, said, no, you're going to have to prove that you can do that. Really? We have to prove that we can find our own airport on a perfectly clear day? That's what we have to do? Yep. Okay. So what happened was, in order to fulfill this, NASA and X-Core agreed that they would do a course along the ground, following certain roads, turning at certain points, and so on. It was essentially a big ellipse, but it had some dog legs here and there for fun. And I was on board because Dick was going to fly the route visually using just the map he had in his lap, the paper map, and his eyeballs. He was going to fly along this predetermined route and follow the line on the ground. We're going to follow this street, and when we get to where this, this outcropping of rock is, we're going to turn right 30 degrees. We're going to head over here to this landmark, and we're going to turn left here, and so on. And that's what we did. And my job was to basically, at every one of these points, Dick would drop a wing, I'd snap a picture to show that we'd been there and so on. But what was going on, the real reason this test was a test was, in the back of the airplane was a GPS recorder, and the GPS was writing our position down electronically. So Dick was flying the plane visually, but the airplane knew where it was to within probably 5 feet at any given time. And here's what's really cool about this. So we get out, and I go home, and they submit the test, and finally I get an email. And the email shows me the ground track as recorded by the GPS, superimposed over the paper map that Dick Rutten had in his lap. And you could not detect the difference between the two. It wasn't like they were close, or it was absolutely perfect. Absolutely perfect. But that kind of thing is the kind of thing that NASA's been doing to keep people out of going to space, and it's not their job. NASA needs to be getting people into space. And then finally, the third thing I talked about was sizzle. The entire Falcon Heavy flight of a couple months ago was so beautifully done in terms of marketing. They needed to test this rocket, and it would have been a rocket test. And it would have been a rocket test that people like me are interested in, and space buffs, and several million Americans and other millions of people around the world would be interested. But it was a rocket test. It was just another rocket test. It was a new rocket, but it was a rocket test. But to instead of using a big slug of concrete or whatever, to put a candy apple red Tesla Roadster in there, and then put a mannequin in the car flying in the same kind of spacesuits that that SpaceX is going to use, and have his arm out the window like he's casually cruising, and the sun is out there because the top is down, and then to be playing David Bowie, and then to have on the navigation screen of the Tesla the words "Don't panic," which is the advice given in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. Well, that's just genius. It's genius all the way across the board. It's just promotional marketing showmanship genius. And because it was all being streamlined, it became a cultural event. It was something cool. It was just cool. So sizzle is something that we don't do at all anymore in the space program. So my recommendations for the space program were basically three. As far as competition goes, I think NASA needs to be essentially disassembled from its current state and turned into something that looks very, very much like its predecessor, NACA, the National Association on Civil Aeronautics, I think, or National Administration of Civil Aeronautics, NACA. Prior to NASA, NACA was doing for aviation what NASA was, I guess, intended to do for spaceflight. And NACA didn't regulate the airline industry. NACA didn't produce airplanes. NACA didn't run airlines. NACA was a pretty much pure research institute where they did a bunch of wind tunnel tests. And even today, when we talk about airplanes like the Long Easy or the Cessna or any airplane that's out there, we'll refer to a certain airfoil as a NACA 1402 or whatever, because as a pure research facility, they did the unprofitable, dirty, but essential job of just getting test data. In other words, how does this airfoil shape perform? What are the numbers for this airfoil shape? What's its lift coefficients, drag coefficients, Reynolds numbers, all this stuff. And then we'll change it. It'll be a new airfoil, new test, new data, new on so on. So we don't all have to have our own wind tunnels and don't have to all go out and test this data. That's what the Wright brothers realized when they started flying, or not flying. They weren't flying because the numbers that they had were wrong. They figured out, instead of tinkering around here all day with these planes that don't work, we need to go back to the basics, build a wind tunnel, and find out what these air pressure data really should be, not what we're told it is. That's why they succeeded and nobody else did. They went right back to the basics. So NASA needs to be doing kind of fundamental foundational research, I think, and most of that, since it's a government bureaucracy, most of that money should be distributed to at least semi-private entities like Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech or Johns Hopkins, who've done superb jobs, really superb jobs of running the pure research aspect of space exploration. Really excellent work on universities. Johns Hopkins sending a probe to the sun, 10 million miles, I want to say, from the sun. Pretty hot there. So they've been great. So that's what I think needs to happen. Basically to NASA, I said that I don't think NASA should have ever get back in the manned space flight business. And I think I said, as far as NASA's safety mandate is concerned, I think NASA's safety mandate should extend only to public safety, not to the safety of the crews, not to the safety of the vehicles. Those are the concerns of the companies that built them and the individuals that sign up. I think NASA does have a role to play in making sure that when we launch a rocket, if it explodes catastrophically, it's not going to come down on people's heads in a way that might be avoidable and so on. Very narrow, very small areas. I also said I suppose they should also be responsible for the safety of the International Space Station, since it's essentially so-called public property. But once you have a private hotel or a private this or a private that up there, it's not up to NASA to determine whether or not this is safe. It's up to the people who are going to go for the ride. NASA has an obligation to protect the public from recklessness, and that's about it. In the same way that the FAA ideally should protect us from recklessness, not tell us where we can fly and not fly and how and when and so on. As far as open source goes, basically I said, no, I think the prize is exactly the answer. You know, we need to get people in here. And the funny thing about a prize is, I said in the case of the X Prize, $10 million got you $30 million worth of vehicle. Because then it becomes kind of ego and pride, and there's a bit of a financial return and publicity. You know, you get your name and company's name on the tail of this thing. It's a great way to go. And then as far as Sizzle's concerned, I close by saying, you know, Sizzle is one of those things. I told this Peter Guber story, which I love. Peter Guber and Mark Peters were these two producers who, I want to say in the 80s, sold Universal to the Japanese. They sold Universal to Japanese businessmen who were, as you may remember from the 80s, looked like were going to own everything in the world. And so these very, very, very financially conservative Japanese businessmen buy a movie company. And just before the deal closed, Peter Guber and Mark Peters went over for a meeting with these Japanese auto executives, or electronics executives, I think it was actually. And they basically had a meeting with them. And these guys were making their final decisions, and they were interested in return on investment and so on. And Peter Guber said, look, we spread the risk. Here's how it works. This studio that you're going to buy, Universal, let's say it has a slate of 10 movies a year. You're going to make 10 movies this coming year. And during this coming year, of those 10 movies, 2 of them will be flops. I'm sorry, 2 of them will be hits, 3 of them will break even, and 5 of them will be losses of various kinds or another. And the Japanese looked at him, in all seriousness, completely puzzled, and they said to Cooper, well, why don't you just make the hits? And I bring up that story because sizzle is a hard thing to identify. It's lightning in a bottle. You don't know when you're going to catch that wave. And like the famous definition of pornography, sizzle is something that you can't really describe, but you know it when you see it. Putting aside the marketing of the whole Falcon Heavy thing with the Tesla and all the rest of it, all that intentional genius. By the way, can anybody imagine Lockheed or Boeing doing something like that? You can imagine somebody having the idea to do something like that, but one person on the hundreds of committees that it'd have to get through would shoot it down for reasons of risk or safety, or somebody might object, or maybe the people who like blue will be complaining that it wasn't blue. All the rest of the reasons you have for not doing anything, there'd be hundreds of those people making that argument. It's inconceivable that a big company would have done something that cool. So sizzle is sizzle, and the example I gave about sizzle I think is actually a rather good one. Having a prize to put a privately funded unmanned lander on the moon, and such a prize does exist. Having $1 million or $100 million prize to put a privately funded remote-controlled lander on the moon is a good idea. But having the same amount of money for a privately owned, remotely controlled lander at the Apollo 11 landing site, now that's a great idea. And the reason that's a great idea, while the moon landing is a good idea, is because if you land a private rover on the moon and you send back 4K high-definition pictures of the surface, that's great. And the space buffs will be impressed, and people like me will be impressed, and we'll be watching it, and we'll be oohing and aahing and so on. But if you land that rover close enough to the Apollo 11 landing site so that you can drive that thing up and see the flag that's been blown over and bleached white, and see the bottom of the LEM stage there, see the footprints, stay a respectful distance away, but you get the general idea. Now, it's not just a space mission, now it's a cultural phenomenon. 40% of millennials and Gen Z thinks that the moon landing was faked. You get every single one of those people, and all the people that want them to just grow up and just acknowledge what happened. You get those people too. So a mission like that has sizzle in the case where one that just simply doesn't. Anyway, those are my recommendations. And whether or not they'll be followed through on, I don't know. I'm beginning to think that the entire idea of NASA is becoming relatively irrelevant, but they still spend as much money as they used to when they were flying for space shuttles. And frankly, I'd like to cut some of that spending, obviously, just on principle, but some of that money could go so much further as prize money and incentives for what would become private enterprises. And eventually this has to be a money-making proposition, or else it's not going to be a future in it. And there is plenty of money to be made out there. Anyway, that's my space program report from today. So we'll take a couple of questions. What time is it? I'll do half an hour maybe, and we will call it a night. Well, somebody commented earlier that a lot of these questions don't seem to be space questions, so I'm going to stick to the rules and look for space questions.